Most developers fail React interviews because they don't understand the fundamental concepts clearly. In this video, we will cover 25 basic React interview questions that every front-end developer should know. Make sure you stay until the end, because the last few questions are very commonly asked in real interviews. Let's begin. Question 1. What is React? JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Component-based architecture. Uses virtual DOM for performance. Here is your interview line. React is a component-based JavaScript library that uses a virtual DOM to efficiently update the user interface. Question 2. What is JSX? JavaScript plus HTML syntax. Converted to React.createElement. Makes user interface easier to write. Here is your interview line. JSX allows us to write HTML-like syntax inside JavaScript, which React converts into. Question 3. What are components? Reusable code units. Can be either functional or class-based, isolated, and self-contained. Here is your interview line. Components are reusable, self-contained building blocks in a React application. Question 4. What is virtual DOM? A lightweight copy of the actual DOM. React uses it to determine what needs to be updated. Faster updates improve performance. Here is your interview line. Virtual DOM is a lightweight copy of the real DOM used by React to perform efficient updates. Question 5. Difference between real DOM and virtual DOM. Real DOM updates the entire structure when changes occur. Virtual DOM updates only the changed elements. Real DOM is slower. Virtual DOM is faster and more efficient. Here is your interview line. Virtual DOM improves performance by updating only the necessary elements instead of the entire DOM. Question 6. What are props? Data passed from parent to child component, read-only, used to make components dynamic. Here is your interview line. Props are read, only data passed from parent to child components. Question 7. What is state? Data managed within a component, can change over time. Updating state triggers re-render. Here is your interview line. State is dynamic data managed inside a component that triggers re-rendering when updated. Question 8. Difference between state and props. Props are read only and passed from parent components. State is managed inside the component and can change. Both control how the component behaves and renders. Here is your interview line. Props are external and read only, while state is internal and changeable. Question 9. What is a functional component? A JavaScript function that returns JSX, uses hooks to manage state and lifecycle. Simpler and preferred approach. Here's your interview line. A functional component is a JavaScript function that returns JSX and uses hooks for state management. Question 10. What is a class component? An ES6 class that extends React.component. Uses render method to return JSX, can use lifecycle methods. Here is your interview line. A class component is an ES6 class that extends React.component and uses lifecycle methods. If you understand these first 10 questions clearly, you already have a strong foundation. Now let's move to the next set of important React interview questions. Here is your question 11. What is one-way data binding? Data flows in a single direction, from parent component to child component, makes application predictable and easier to debug. Here is your interview line. One-way data binding means data flows from parent to child, making the application. Here is your question 12. What is reconciliation? The process of updating the DOM. React compares the previous virtual DOM with the new virtual DOM. Only the changed elements are updated in the real DOM. Here is your interview line. Reconciliation is the process where React compares virtual DOM versions and updates only the changed elements. Here is your question 13. What are keys in React? Unique identifiers used in lists. Help React identify which items changed. Improve performance during re-rendering. Here is your interview line. Keys are unique identifiers that help React efficiently update and manage lists. Here is your question 14. What is conditional rendering? Rendering components based on certain conditions. Uses if statements or conditional operators. Controls what appears in the user interface. Here is your interview line. Conditional rendering allows components to render different content based on. Here is your question 15. What are fragments? Used to group multiple elements. Do not add extra nodes to the DOM. Represented using empty angle brackets. Here is your interview line. Fragments allow grouping of elements without adding extra nodes to the D. What is conditional rendering? Render different UI elements based on logical conditions. Uses standard JavaScript logical operators. For example, if, else, ternary, and double ampersand. Only the matched content is rendered to the DOM, improving efficiency. Here is your interview line. Conditional rendering is a technique to dynamically show different components or elements based on true or false conditions, just like with standard JavaScript logical statement. Now we are moving to one of the most important topics in React interviews, hooks. Most Real-world React applications use hooks extensively. Understanding these clearly can significantly increase your chances of getting selected. Let's begin with the first. Here is your question 17. What is useState? A React hook that lets you add state variables to functional components. Retains value across re-renders and triggers re-renders when updated. Returns a pair, the current state value, and a function to update it. Can hold any type of value, objects, arrays, strings, etc., unlike class-based state. Here is your interview line. useState is a hook that allows functional components to maintain and manage local state. Here is your question 18. What is useEffect? A React hook that lets you perform side effects in functional components. Runs after every render, including the first, but can be controlled with dependencies. Replaces class lifecycle methods. Component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. Ideal for data fetching, DOM updates, setting up subscriptions, and manual cleanup. Here is your interview line. useEffect is a hook that manages all side effects such as fetching data, subscriptions, and manual DOM change. Here is your question 19. What is the dependency array in useEffect? An optional array passed as a second argument to the useEffect hook. Determines when the side effect should run after a component render. The effect is skipped if none of the variables in the array have. Here is your question 20. What is useRef? A React hook that returns a mutable ref object with a .current property. Values in .current persist across re-renders and do not trigger new renders when updated. Commonly used to access DOM elements directly or to store mutable values that are not part of the state, like a box where you can place a mutable value that React will not track. Here is your interview line. useRef creates a mutable object whose value is stored in .current. It persists. Here's your question 21. What is useMemo? A React hook that returns a memoized cached value. It computes the result only when one of its dependency values changes, avoiding unnecessary recalculations. Designed primarily for optimizing performance when dealing with expensive computations, like a selective cache for an expensive function result based on specific input variables. Here's your interview line. useMemo caches the result of an expensive calculation. Here's your question 22. What is useCallback? A React hook that returns a memoized cached callback function. It computes the function instance only when one of its dependency values changes. Designed to prevent unnecessary re-renders of child components that receive functions as props. A selective cache for a callback function based on specific input variables. Here's your interview line. useCallback caches a specific function instance, recreating it only when its dependencies change to ensure that dependent child components do not re-render unnecessarily. Here's your question 23. What is a custom hook? A custom hook is a reusable JavaScript function that encapsulates logic using existing React hooks, for example, useState and useEffect, designed primarily to extract and share stateful logic between different components, like a selective cache for shared logic based on specific input variables or behavior. The function name must always start with use, for example, useFetch or useAuth by convention. Here's your interview line. A custom hook is a function that extracts component-level stateful logic using React hooks, allowing it to be easily reused across multiple parts of your application. Here's your question 24. When does useEffect run? A React hook that runs a function, the side effect after every component render. By default, it executes after the initial render, component mounting, and after every subsequent re-render. Designed primarily to perform side effects, for example, data fetching, subscriptions, and DOM updates after the UI is drawn. Can be precisely controlled using a dependency array, as explained in the interview. Here's your interview line. useEffect runs after every render, including the initial one, by default. Its execution is based on specific input variables or behavior defined in its optional. Here is your question 25. Can we use hooks inside loops? No. Hooks must be called at the top level of a component. Hooks cannot be used inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. Here is your interview line. Hooks must always be called at the top level. If you understand these 25 questions clearly, you already have a strong foundation in React. Revise them regularly and practice explaining them confidently. If you found this helpful, stay tuned for more advanced React interview questions. Keep learning and keep building.